Okay, to start off our talk on plant nutrient uptake, first let's do a little review about plant nutrients. What are they, and what do some of their deficiencies look like in the plant? All right, so this is a brief list, a concise list, I should say, of the macronutrients and the micronutrients that are needed for plant growth. Macronutrients are those nutrients that are needed in higher amounts than micronutrients. The top three macronutrients that are needed for building the body and the biomass of the plant are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are obtained through the air. The carbon is obtained through the air in the form of CO2 that goes in through the stomata of the leaves and into the body of the plant. Hydrogen is obtained through water that comes in through the soil in the roots. And oxygen is also obtained through the air, through the stomata, but it's also obtained by water from the roots, and the hydrogen and oxygens in the water are split off, and that is a product of photosynthesis is oxygen. We all know that plants absorb CO2 and release oxygen. It's a little more complex than that, but those three nutrients, the macronutrients, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are important, but us humans who take care of the plants and care about them, whether you're a farmer or a landscaper or a homeowner, those things are not things we worry about because plants get those pretty much on their own, except we have to water plants. But it's nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and potassium are the 6 macronutrients that we focus on when we're thinking of fertilizing or soil. How much is there of those in the soil that we need to maintain for plant growth? So those 6 are the important ones. An acronym that I was told when I was studying botany at Davis as an undergrad was at the bottom there of the macronutrients, SHNOPS, Cal, Mag, Pot. The C stands for carbon, H for hydrogen, N for nitrogen, O for oxygen, P for phosphorus, S for sulfur, then calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So it's just a quick little acronym to help you remember all of those. Micronutrients are essential, but they're needed in trace amounts, very small amounts. Some of them are chlorine, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum, and boron. An acronym for that some of my City College students made up was Chimborazo, some of the first letters of all of those. Think of micronutrients kind of like micronutrients are for humans. Iron is also one of a human micronutrient. We don't need a lot of it, but we have to have that little amount or we won't do too well. So these are all the same for plants. How do these nutrient deficiencies look in the plant? I like this little chart because it's showing you in general, what that deficiency of that nutrient will look like in the leaves of a plant, and also show you where on the stem, like the maturity level, that deficiency will show up. So you can see near the top something like a sulfur deficiency. You'd see newer leaves yellow. The leaves get light green, the veins pale green. That would be a sulfur deficiency. If you have yellowing leaves at the bottom or older leaves, that's a nitrogen deficiency. Nitrogen can be moved in a plant, and the growing tip is the most important part where the plant is focusing its energy. So if the plant's growing and doing pretty well and there's plenty of nitrogen in the soil, and then suddenly, not suddenly, but it absorbs enough nitrogen that there's none left in the soil and it's not getting replenished, the plant will take nitrogen from its old leaves that were formed a while ago and move it to the new leaves that need it the most, and those old leaves start to turn yellow. So part of the deficiency of symptoms that you see from deficiencies relates to the ability of a nutrient to be translocated, to be moved about by the plant, inside the plant. Some things like calcium can't be moved. Once the plant absorbs calcium and puts it into its body, into its cells, it can't be moved to a new place in the plant that might need it more, like nitrogen can. So you would see the calcium deficiencies show up on the new growth. And you can look at those. A lot of micronutrients show up with kind of a yellowish leaf and green veins, but there's a bunch of different looks to the deficiency of nutrients. It helps us diagnose them because we don't, unless we do a soil test and unless we do a nutrient test on the tissue of the leaf, it's hard to know. But if you get a general feel for what some of these deficiencies look like, you can just eyeball it and make a pretty good guess. But how exactly do those nutrients that are in the soil that are so important for plant growth get from the soil into the plant? To understand that pathway, first we have to look at some of the anatomy of cells and tissues and the roots and the root tips from where the first place that water goes into the plant. And water goes in through the roots, but it's the nutrients that are dissolved in that water. That's the way the nutrients get in, by being dissolved in the water that the plant absorbs. And that first starts with the plant's roots. So let's look at root anatomy. The picture shows you on the epidermal layer of a root. So it's just like in humans, our epidermis is the outer layer of skin. The epidermis on a plant, be it the leaf, stem, or root, is the outer layer of cells. If it's a root epidermis, then those outer layer of cells have these little tubular projections, extensions of those cells that reach out further into the soil and create a lot more surface area for absorption of water and the nutrients that are in that water. Those root hairs are short-lived. They don't live for more than a few days usually. When you transplant a plant and pull it up or dig it up and you kind of jostle the roots and soil around, often those root hairs, which are microscopic mostly, they break off. And so when you transplant it, that plant might wilt for a while. And then within about a day, those root hairs grow, new ones grow back, and that plant's able to absorb water again. Guard cells are cells in the leaves that control the opening and closing of the pores, the stoma or stomata. And they regulate water evaporation out of the leaves and carbon dioxide intake into the leaves. So the guard cells are in those leaves, and some of the moisture that's moving up from the roots into the plant and into the leaves exits through those guard cells. And that's just water movement from the roots all the way up to the leaves, and the water movement is also involving nutrient movement within the plant because the nutrients are dissolved in the water. So wherever the water moves as it goes up to the leaves, the nutrients are also moving in that direction too. And so that's a way that the nutrients move around. There are two systems of pipes inside plants, or two separate vascular systems. Loosely analogous to, we have veins and arteries that move our blood around. In a plant, there's xylem tissue, and that is a system of hollow pipes that moves water from the root hairs all the way into the center of the plant, where these pipes go all the way up to the leaves and the stomata, where the water or oxygen can be released through those pores. So the xylem is the system that moves water around and the nutrients that are in that water. Phloem tissue is another system of pipes, and the liquid doesn't move quite as fast in the phloem, and that's where the sap is moving. The sugars that are dissolved in water and hormones move around in the phloem pipes inside the plant. But the xylem is the one that's moving the nutrients around, if we're talking about nutrient uptake, and we are. And this is where it gets kind of fun, detailed. The plant's vascular system, just to go into a little more detail, you can see the picture in the image on the right. The xylem are those cells that are more orangish here in this slide, and the water is moving up through those xylem cells from the roots, the root hairs to the roots, all the way up the stem are xylem cells, and they're pretty much just hollow, dead cells, hollow pipes, and the water is moving up with the nutrients in them. The phloem is to the outside of that. If you're looking at the plant stem, you've got xylem to the center and phloem on the outside, and the cambium is in the middle. The cambium is the layer that is actually creating new cells, dividing and creating new xylem and new phloem. New xylem to the inside of a stem and new phloem to the outside as that stem grows. The phloem is where the sap is moving, and it moves down mostly because the sugars are made in the leaves where photosynthesis is happening. But phloem also moves sap up, down, and sideways. It's all over the place. As opposed to xylem, it's just moving water up from the roots to the leaves and into the stems. The center of a woody plant stem is called the pith. I've told you a little bit about this layer, the cambium layer, and that's the outer layer of cells, just inside the phloem, which is just inside the epidermis. And if you want to read a little bit more about xylem cells and phloem cells, there's some information there on the left. How does water move up in the roots from the root hairs all the way to the leaves? Imagine a 50 or 100-foot tree. What's making the water move up? Is there little pumps on the way? Is there some kind of suction that's moving the water up? Well, yes, a little bit of both. It's a theory that best explains this. It's very well accepted. It's called the tension cohesion theory. It's like when you suck on a straw, which is these days has to be paper. When you suck on a straw, it's pulling up liquid from the bottom of the straw into your cup, and it's sucking it up into your mouth. So there's a suction on the top of the straw, and it's pulling in liquid from the bottom. It's similar in a plant where water is escaping out of the xylem through the stomata in the leaves, and as that water evaporates out of the leaves, out from the inside of the plant to the outside, it's creating a suction on the bottom of the plant. So the water evaporating out of the leaves is creating a suction that translates all the way down to the roots, and that creates the force that's sucking the water and nutrients in on the roots. So if you had a plant and you prevented it from water evaporating out of its leaves, it would not suck any new water in on the roots. It's that flow. And the process of water evaporating out of the leaves from the xylem in the leaves into the atmosphere is called transpiration. It's kind of like plant perspiration. Plants are releasing water vapor out of their leaves through the stomata, and that water leaving the xylem at the top is translated all the way down through the xylem, which is like one continuous tube all the way to the roots, to all the roots, that sucks water in those roots. So that is one reason. The cohesion part is that it still wouldn't work unless you had water molecules that were cohesive, meaning each water molecules stick to each other, forming an unbroken column. And that's why a straw works too. When you suck water out of the top of the straw, how do you suck all that, whatever you're sucking, Gatorade or a smoothie? It's because those molecules of that liquid stick together. So you suck some off the top and it pulls more in. If they weren't sticky to each other, it wouldn't work. It'd be like trying to suck sand up through a straw. Each piece is not connected to the other, and it wouldn't work. So it's the tension created by evaporation, transpiration, and the cohesion of the water that makes the water go up. And this is a quiet, and it doesn't use any, it's a quiet process, doesn't use any energy source. It's just a mechanical system, but it can pump water up huge distances, 100, 200, sometimes 300 feet in the tallest of trees. Pretty amazing. So how do sugars move around? How does the sap move within the phloem? It moves by a different process than the xylem. It moves by the pressure flow hypothesis. Pressure in a plant is created through a sugar concentration gradient, meaning there are areas in the phloem that have more concentrated sugar in the sap, has a lot more sugar in it than other areas. It's the simple process of diffusion where you have a more concentrated area. Those molecules there, like the sugar molecules in leaves where the sugar is made, have a much more highly concentrated sugar content than the other areas of the plant, the stems and the roots. So sugar, by diffusion, wants to diffuse, and those sugar molecules want to move out and equalize the concentration throughout the plant. They tend to move from high concentration to low concentration. So they're going to move from the leaves, they're going to move away from the leaves, the sugar molecules in the phloem. Also, sap can be moved against a concentration gradient using energy by the plant. The phloem cells are alive. They're not like xylem cells, which are just kind of like empty pipes. The phloem cells actually can use energy and move the sugars wherever they want. So even if they are needed, even if the sugar gradient is not moving sugars from high to low, they can be moved, more sugars can be moved into a higher concentrated area as well. So it's not just passive diffusion. There's actually active transport of those sugar molecules to wherever they're needed. That's probably all you need to know about the pressure flow hypothesis. Ask me if you want more details and you want to understand this better. All right, so nutrients are uptaken by those root hairs in the soil, if they're there, by three main methods. One is root extension. It's just the root growing out into the soil and being extending out into the soil and interacting or meeting other nutrients, so it can find more nutrients. And that's one way. So the root's kind of reaching out and encountering more nutrients. Also, nutrients are uptaken by mass flow. That's the water absorbed by a root creates a water deficit near the root in the soil, and then more water moves near to the root carrying nutrients with the water. So if you imagine just on a really short time scale, those little roots are in the soil and they suck up a little water, and for a moment, because they sucked up the water near them, there's no water near them. And then that makes more water in the soil move towards the roots to kind of fill in that gap, that little hole that was created by that water loss. It's pretty similar to the process that's happening by transpiration, which is water's leaving the leaves, which is creating a suction at the roots, and the suction at the roots creates a little dry area for a moment near the root tips, and that makes more water flow towards those tips to fill that gap, and then the plant can take in even more water with more nutrients. And that's important for some nutrients that are needed in large quantities, like potassium, calcium, and nitrogen for sure. The third method is diffusion, movements of the nutrients due to an imbalance of concentration. They want to go from a high concentrated area to a lower concentrated area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So nutrients moving into the plant by diffusion. Again, if there is a root sticking in the soil, imagine some nutrients are on the outside. The plant needs those, or it needs the water too, and it absorbs them. And then you can get because there's less of that nutrient inside the root, those nutrients tend to move into the root because they're trying to move across that barrier and equalize the amount of nutrient on either side, inside the root and outside the root. There's a picture there of a phosphate ion, just a little graphic that was made showing how it moves into the root hair tip because there's more on the outside, and it wants to equalize it on either side of that root hair tip cell layer. That's just simple diffusion. That elements tend to want to equal out the concentration between either side of a certain barrier, like a plasma membrane or an epidermal layer, something like that. What are some conditions where nutrient uptake occurs? Well, the plants have to be growing. Metabolic energy is needed. Plant roots must be able to respire. They are cells, and they do metabolism. And so plants are able to make their own food. They make sugars through photosynthesis, but then they store those sugars, and when they need them for metabolic processes like growth, they break those sugars down in the process of respiration, and they create oxygen. We don't make our own food as humans, but we take in plant and animal biomass and do respiration. We break down the molecules of the foods we take in and we respire. So we need oxygen for respiration. So the roots need oxygen, is what the point is here. So there has to be air in the soil as well for all this to happen, for nutrients to be uptaken and for plants to live. You need air and water. Root hairs are the most active points of nutrient uptake, as I've already said, and root hairs grow and die all the time. A total side note here, root hairs don't last too long, so that means as plants grow and die, they're actually adding organic matter to the soil around their roots because the root hairs die off and leave that organic matter in the soil. So that can be a healthy thing. It's kind of the basis of why cover crops work. You grow a crop and then cut it down when it's at full maturity, and all the roots release their organic matter into the soil. The conditions for nutrient uptake is also, the process is selective. The nutrients are uptaken by what is needed by the plant. The plant won't take in more than what it needs necessarily. And the plasma membrane is like the cell, part of the cell layer. Inside the cell wall is this plasma membrane, which is part of the cell, but it's permeable, but it's selective too. Only certain things are allowed in or not. The plant, in a sense, knows what it needs inside those cells, and it will not let in things that it doesn't need or create too high of a concentration of something. That's what we mean by selective. The plant is filtering and only letting in what it needs. And the plasma membrane is part of the cells of those root hairs that do that filtering. Here's a little graphic of the plasma membrane. So you have a cell wall of a plant when you have a root sticking in the soil and you've got nutrients dissolved in the water outside of the root. The outer layer, that epidermal layer of cells that makes up the root tip, has a cellulose cell walls. Each of the cells in the root hair epidermis has a cell wall. All the cells in the plant do, and they're rigid, they're stiff, and they're made of cellulose. That's why plants, don't move much, and they're pretty much just upright, and you can snap the twigs. They're rigid. They're not like mammals and other things that are soft and flexible like we are. Just inside the cell wall is this thing called a plasma membrane, and most other organisms have these. Not all of them, not things that aren't plants don't have the cell wall that's rigid. But inside the cell wall on a plant is the plasma membrane, and it's made of two layers, those blue little spheres, and it has these proteins, those purple things that span the whole membrane. And that's where the nutrients go through these little chutes, these little holes. The proteins, like this is showing you on the outside of the cell, the calcium gets into the root tip, gets to the plasma membrane, and it can go through to the inside of the cell through that protein. That's one of the ways that the cell is filtering what can come in and out. Those proteins, where the nutrients come in and out, they are different shapes. They won't allow everything in. Some are for certain nutrients and some are for others. So these cells have a way of knowing and have a way of selecting what comes in and out. Here's another way of showing you what I was just explaining in the last slide. The upper right picture, you've got the plasma membrane, which has two layers, and you see the little blue proteins coming, the little blue nutrients coming through that purple protein little tunnel. And they're also showing you nitrates and potassium. The nitrate is NO3, and a molecule can bring that from the outer space into the inner space of that cell. So there's proteins that are carrying the nutrient molecules inside, from the outside to the inside of the plant cells, and then they're transported to where they're needed. This is a lot of detail that you don't need to know all this detail, but some of it kind of helps you with a greater understanding of how nutrients are uptaken by looking at some of the cellular processes. Okay, just to repeat and review the overall process of nutrient uptake, a nutrient ion is picked up by a carrier ion and moved inside the plant's cell membrane. From there, the water, which has the nutrients in it, can move towards the center of the root through each cell or between cells until it gets to what's called the endodermis. You can see a picture of it at the bottom. The endodermis is a little round red layer of cells that are thickened, so they're another kind of like another little moat or drawbridge. Only certain things can get to the very center of the root where the nutrients are moved more quickly. So that endodermis is impermeable cylinder of cells, and the water nutrient ion is forced to go into that, and then it can move in greater distances more quickly throughout the plant. Once it gets in there and passes this little, nutrient check there, and the endodermis only allows certain things in, then it can move more freely in the xylem that is in the center of that cell, which is blue. So the nutrient ion moves in through the root hair, can be moved inside the cells through the plasma membrane, and then it moves from the outside through that yellow stuff, trying to get to the xylem, the blue stuff in the center, where it can move very quickly throughout the plant. And finally get to the xylem where it's moved to the spots that the water and nutrients are needed in the plant.